The systems of Boss Baby, as is generated from the projection, is the understood value owed to David Bowles at the point of birth, as is recognized in law, but actively subverted by the double agent confederacy, such as the insurgent terrorists and the judiciary, which are intentionally avoiding their obligation to recognize their duty and service to law in favor of the Confederate insurrection for its various damages and extortions. Now, principally, the understanding would be that the damages proper or acts of violation would have their own principal damages as a value, as a liability, as well as the profits generated by the extortion, which will also implement the use of their access to power by the equation of their use of extortion, at which point the financial value to them of the extortionary power generates its own principal value, which is going to be added, at which point there's going to have to be a business model consistently being generated, plus additional inconvenience fees to victims beyond the original extortion value to the extorters, generating some kind of equation for justice in financial settlements, as the position of the terrorist insurrection is derived under the assumption that the United States laws are systematically changed into Confederate laws. You have the understanding of the extortions from the Confederacy for the advantage of primary motives of financial gain, generating the primary mechanism to counter that, the attack against the motive, which would be financial punishment concerning these mechanisms, at which point the surface value generated in the confinement for the purpose of payment or settlements upon the stipends to account of their compelled labors will generate them in a confined location until said settlements have been completely derived, at which point the Confederacy has a different culture to the United States, which would be a layer of David's system, at which point one of the layer of $800 billion worth of companies, which will include lawyers to oversee the Confederacy and the correct management to not genocide the peoples, generates the obligation for the full legal systems to have been completely processed and divined, at which point the experts in the question generate the systematic equation of competent punishment, generated the total liability at all levels, at which point you'll have the long-term settlements of all liabilities, which is the basis of many of the black communities processing to Boss Baby about the arguments to sell debts from the Confederacy owed to them to David Bowles, generating his ability to purchase it means he is the one to sell it to, at which point selling it to him generates their ability to engage in the original calculation of their economic value in the long term, as David was obstructed the restoration of David's title and business practices for as long as they would have been in the long-standing preparations, generates their ability to engage in the settlements, at which point David would have, upon the collection of the due diligence from the lawyer layer, generated the means for them to receive payment through the purchase of Confederate corporations from the various companies which the Confederates would be compelled to work on, stipends to pay their liabilities. At which points you have the mechanism of transferring the debts owed to them, and as a prerequisite you have the ability to deliver the products being sold, which is going to be in the settlements, as business will require it to be fully competent before the agreement has been fully settled, including full insurance by speculators who have full confidence and good faith in it, the value of the product, being willing to cover it to the predetermined strike price or otherwise projected value, generating the status quo ability to sell the contracts of the status quo function, allowing for the work contracts for a month or a quarter or 6 months or a year or etc. Generates the ability of the sales and distributions on the commissions funding David's brokerage derived by the first layer, which, having stopped the crash of '08 in the projections, includes the Fed's arguments for David to save the major bankers who, being told to give the major loans which were not credible by the United States Congress, would have been extorted into a suicide position, and thus contracts would have to be derived in order to save them, at which point David, taking the purchased debts owed to the injured communities, would sell it in the contracts, specifically derivative of those arrangements, so that the government settlement of the thing is them bailing out the bankers in question, as that is the solution that would be provided. The entire thing has a complete settlement in its variations and arrangements, and the contract value of the first layer from the brokerage has work contracts on that schedule which are actively sold and distributed for all of the other layers, including the second layer, which, being finished on its contract value, is sold to the third layer, and so on until you have the seventh layer, with the projection of David starting his own kingdom. At which point you have these systems of the various economic arrangements as a total network of the active sales and distributions of contracts and stocks and bonuses, etc., as the active market of the high price exchanges and the high security arrangements become a position of a fixture of the United States original economy, as economic national security, being fully in place, generates the Congress's confidence and being able to sell their deals with David through the power brokering as a mechanism of getting elections, at which points the presidents and all other mechanisms making deal with David would be essential to their influence with the United States public in order to get the votes, at which point they don't get elected unless they're compliant, at which point David's active trades on the power brokering through the brokerage becomes a reinforced economic powerhouse, generating the automation of the consistent sales and distributions of said profits, generating the continuation of these stacked values, including the second layer of Snapple facts generated by the horoscope Libra and Tiger, at which point Fire Tiger Libra generates the women's interests, primarily through makeup, clothes, hairstyles, at which point the clothing and other systems as a prerequisite to future layers generates the systematic ability for them to make a customer, which is a long-term stacked customer, generating over a decade or several decades worth of sales, allows for the equipment to specifically be attuned, for the product specifically to be attuned to the specific customer in question, which, generating similar customers for the same product, would be able to conduct the reproduction on that mass generation, at which point you have the dedicated members of the accounts and you have the general customers, which will arbitrarily follow the dedicated customer base, at which point you have the systems which are actively in place, which are a schedule of the larger mechanism of people generating their ability to be attracted to David as a character, following Boss Baby and the various caravans through the West Coast. From Washington to California, the act of engaging in surveying the land and territory for the various business models to be constructed onto the projections for the finalizing of the settlements of the creation of the businesses sold to the business contracts, the work contracts being sold by the companies, generating the finished due diligence of those companies, generates the ability of it to be used as work facilities which sell work contracts for exponential sales and distributions on the common commission system of David's brokerage. At which point, David, being extremely wealthy from these arrangements, would have his own butlers and maids who, having his cards and access to his accounts under his orders would allow David to arbitrarily purchase and engage in various desirable services along said paths ahead of time, generated on their payment of the promise of the delivery of those products in those due schedule. At which point you have the systems of David actively going about, actively being funded, at which point the unrestraint against David removes the threats and damages against Don Sr., which means the Confederacy not being able to traffic Don Sr. because their lack of an extortion value generates his compliance with the good faith behavior of the normal function under the economy without the criminal terrorisms and extortions and poisonings generated by the compromise system of the Satanist clusterfuck that is the Confederate insurrection, which generated J-Secular civil war for a long-standing systems of these abuses, which is a policy generated specifically to attack the Bowles family, specifically David Bowles, generating his ability to have conducted, his ability to defeat the United States enemies, foreign and domestic, as the general and as the aristocracy. They had no vital mechanism of being able to overcome him at any of the various mechanisms, and as they're engaged in a criminal insurrection, their war crimes, primarily derived by poisonings, terrorisms, and defamations, generates the ability of the United States public to be secure with David and vulnerable without David, at which point you have the compounding systems by the zombie insurance, which generates the long-standing sustainability of all mechanisms of the economy under the extreme stress of said apocalypse or war or tragedy in question, generating their ability to sustain themselves through the threat in question, generating Lindsey Graham's character's position of disgust and outrage at the position of the United States winning the Civil War, compelling them to engage in a hot war upgrade beyond the poisons and defamations into direct violence by the war criminal scumbags who hate the United States and everything it stands for, generating our particular differences. And the position of the Snapple Facts generates the prerequisite sales and conditions to the entertainment system, such as David's connection to Angelina Jolie and many of the other major actors and actresses and supermodels, etc. And the specific interest from that arrangement is derived by their assumption that those connections automatically being arranged for the various settlements of market price for the Confederacy engaged in a non-war tactic to settle financial dealings, which is the obligation of the United States government to limit them in their ability to implement the threats, generates their dereliction of duty or their compliance, and upon their compliance you have the full delivery of these products, at which point you have the assumption ability of the sales and distributions of those work contracts, which includes the ability to have bought and distributed the work contracts for the rejection hotline, which is the romantic interest in question, at which point the dating sites and etc. for the romantic interest being settled fully takes care of the possibility of David's eventual gaining age to the point of puberty, generating his obligation to settle his normal romantic obligations, as she doesn't want to engage in his direct attention. She would want to distract it by the collection of short-term and long-term relationships, actively supporting that ability, at which point the full settlement of David's sexual attention being distracted away from her allows them to engage in professional relationships, continuing the normal work contracts on the determined schedules, generating the ability for this to produce the value from those systems derived by David's original sexual market value, which is derived by the high value women distracting him from sexual attention, at which point the value of that distraction is their minimum bar of the sexual market value, at which point the dating pool actively has to start negotiating for David's sexual attention, generating the sexual market value or market price of the status quo position, generating David's ability to have continued under his unobstructed relationships romantic and otherwise, generating the value of that principle as well as the extortion value of the profits that they derive by the rape culture. Attacking that system has its total power value in financial terms, plus the inconvenience fees and liabilities which would also be attached to them, generates the basis of what they owe under their consistent damages and intentions, generating the systems of our perpetual liabilities, such as J-Secular Civil War's attack on the food supply, such as their attacks on the farm's crops or cattle's, at which point the position of their attacks on the cattle, such as the poisoning with viruses of the cattle with the various diseases derived by the gain-of-function research generating for the damages to the general public, should be considered an obligation to purchase said cattle, as it is the equivalent value of not being able to sell that cattle without injuring the customer, which is a criminal action generating its position as functionally destroyed property, at which point they are liable to pay the value as though they had hit it on the road with their car, having to purchase the entire cow or cattle in general, at which point the vulnerability of compromising the cattle in question generates their obligation to pay for the entirety of the cattle derived by those that they put in the vulnerability in question, which is the obligation of the government to have protected the public and their property against those vulnerabilities, generating their obligation to enforce the protections against them, including the arrest of the insurrectionist war criminal scumbags engaged in these vulnerabilities, generating their obligation to have purchased said damaged property. At which point you have that, plus you have the extortion value, which is derivative of the power that they gained as a result of the financial exchanges on the black market, as the act of war is actively supported and distributed on the basis of the black market's crime distribution. These war criminals engage in the various trades of the crime, funds their war, which funds more crime, which funds their war, which funds their crime. Continuing these procedures to their natural conclusion generates the obligation of the rest and distribution to their correct categories in the various accounts, generating our obligations to have protected the public and calculate the due diligence of the original economy under the original government, under the original American policies for the full settlement and the confinement of the Confederate war criminals with their KKK militia, and the invisible empire being an obligation to find and arrest and confine into the Confederate state derived by the businesses purchased by the debts owed to the injured communities, generally speaking, generates their obligation to be subject to those companies with the active services under the stipends as employees, generating the perpetual revenues from the business structure under the arrangements. The full accounts and acquisitions must be settled in the correct position under law and under the economic accountants, generating our ability to proceed to a more viable economy and American public safety. Generating our ability to do these structures, you have the calculation of the various damages, such as the engagement of the 9/11, which is derived by the restraint against David's age security in New York, generating the damages in 9/11, generating the war on terror. And now, David not being able to stop the war on terror without stopping 9/11 still would have a problem stopping 9/11. Stopping 9/11 is feasible, but it generates the difficulty for the purpose of 9/11, which is the war on terror and the extortionary Confederate policies derived as the Patriot Act and other insurrectionist criminal procedures normalized under the public noses, generating the systematic threats from their rape culture, as the rape systems are generated as a black market function for the funding and distributions of the powers of the Confederacy and their insurrection, which is J-Secular Civil War after they had overthrown the Republic of California and functioning as a Confederate system of terrorism, generates the second federal government loyal to the Confederacy. As California is a platform in that arrangement, David's original influence in the United States would have engaged his political party, which would have also had been essential to the California's republic, at which point the Civil War between the Confederacy and the Republic would have sided with the Republic against the Confederacy, arresting and nullifying all of the supporters of J. Sekulow in his insurrection. The prison industrial complex and other such systems derived as the processing of the procedure of the terrorist insurgent infection, compromising the various government systems to steal government equipment for the Confederate interest against the United States, generates our ability to engage in the full due diligence of all sales and acquisitions for these procedures in their full complexities, generating the ability to calculate the value of each sales contract. The work contract generated for its amount of time, whether it's a week, a month, a quarter, 6 months, or a year, etc., generates the obligation of calculating the full value of the product estimated in the position, at which point these are subcontracts derived by cutting up the total projection, which is assumed collectively going to compound the reaffirmation of the insured value of the 800 billion for the layer, generating its specific subdivision of having its specific value, which would actively be negotiated on the market, at which point the active negotiations trading on the market increases the various values as it increases and decreases on the basis of its base value from its insurance protected position at the very bottom from the speculators, generating our ability to calculate the full procedure value of each of these mechanisms, and the prison system in question generating its alterations from the Confederate infection into the American system will actively require its compliance with the system of transforming the Confederate loyalists into the Confederate system under the advice of the lawyers and other legal procedures, generating for the collection of customs of the Confederacy as to not genocide the psychopath system of the Satan-worshipping scumbags. At which point the Luciferian shitheads in question, generating the position of infecting the false assumption of Christianity in the United States law and order, generates their position as an infection, engaging in their lies as they follow their father, which is Lucifer, which is the father of lies, which is their father, which is their system, which is their religion. These generating damages facilitated by their druid system under the advice and orders of the destruction of society as a collective custom, generates its obligation to be settled under the American oversight and order, generating the obligation to turn their incompetent defamations and lies and schemes into an ordered society, which is a contradiction. At that point, the complications being acknowledged still have to be satisfied in the full due diligence on the calculation, requiring everyone to engage in their specific calculations to make their specific claims. As no one person can understand the entirety of an economy, it generates the collective interest to specifically focus on their specialty aspect of said economy, generating a collective series of claims to the judiciary, which are obligated to side with the United States and accept the orders which they must process and compel on to the Confederate insurrectionists, generating our ability to acquire safety against the insurrection, at which point the obligation to do so, having been avoided by a dereliction of duty, generates a series of fines and liabilities onto the government proper, as it did not have authority to tolerate the violations, at which point it, not being Confederate, was still liable to not avoid the position of being vulnerable to that system, at which point that strategy has to be categorized into its series of liabilities, specifically adjusted to the entire value of every extortionary advantage that they were seeking, to the full value that they would be willing to pay for in order to engage in the subject, generating the additional fees in proportion to the intended damages or their willingness to pay for the value or market price of the extortion powers. loyalty to the United States is treason to the Confederacy, and treason to the United States is loyalty to the Confederacy, at which point the obligation for each person to settle which country they side with in the Civil War is necessary for their long-term establishment in their positions in the general society, and their corrected accounts on the various due diligences along the lines of the restoration of the obstructions property value, generating the obligation for the full correction of the entire extortion into the settlement of the reconfinement of the Confederates, generating the perpetuation of the obligation, asserting that each department that believed that it was retaliating against David, such as many of the gangs in California, which claimed to be police, along with many of the gangs derived in Homeland Security, the military, the FBI, CIA, etc., generates these positions of their more malleable positions and complications, generating a difficult assessment on the specific means of engaging with them separate to their specific position, as though they would have otherwise been a faction of the Confederate feudalist structure. At which point, not quite being Confederate requires them to be treated differently, at which point it is still derivative of the position of their obligation to pay the fines and liabilities, etc., just under a different procedure, as Confederates are a specific class of systems, generating our arguments for the position of the FBI from the character generating their attacks against David under the assumption that he would have dissolved them as intelligence oversight at the highest levels, generating their inability to sustain themselves, their defending of their jobs by attacking him in treason, sedition, and high crimes in support of the Confederacy, throw those complications in their particular order, generating the obligation to engage in the settlement. Some in those arrangements have projected that David would have dissolved them, at which point the recreation of another version of it without the infecting insurrectionists or other compromised mechanisms generates the assumption that they would have to subordinate themselves to a primary leader of government, at which point the subjects of them leaving subordination as a recreated organization would no longer be under the DOJ. Many have projected that SCOTUS would have been a far preferable position over that, at which point the full investigation and due diligence of the resettlements of that system was believed by many of their agents to have subordinated themselves to SCOTUS, at which point the position of FISA under the secrecy position of their false clearances generates a complication of doublespeak, complication without the service of value, would have tried to have taken the Supreme Court and subordinated it to something else, which means it would no longer be the Supreme Court, and these positions of executive Confederate arrangements generating the complete disillusionment of all order under the constitutional system, at which point all executive functions are subordinate to the president at service to his office, not to the president directly, at which point the office of the presidency, being the leader of all executive functions, does not change the obligation for this specialty to be subordinated to the specific office in question in the case of checks and balances for the competition of those arrangements, generating the obligation for the full calculation, as it is understood that the legislator has intelligence oversight powers. The intelligence oversight function of David Bull's branch of the military is assumed specifically subordinate to Congress as a specialty, generating those positions of the intelligence oversight systems for the mechanism of the checks and balances in the proper order at the highest levels, generating the unique highest grade general in the mechanism, the stability of the long-term viability of the United States politically, economically, and otherwise, generating our due diligence to calculate the mechanism of the full correction, as many of the Confederates had gotten in through voter fraud from David's absence, derived by their terrorist insurrections, through the function of the DOJ's order to engage in the voter fraud as a strategy of their KKK denomination, generating the replacement of the elected officials from the American Republic to the Confederate Wizard Court government. With the full due diligence taken for granted as an assumption, the Homeland Security mechanism is going to have to engage in the full due diligence as a mechanism of their service to the courts, which is an obligation to the existence of them not being dissolved as a collective structure, as they are engaged in insurrection in compliance with an enemy of the United States, if they do not support the United States Republic against these criminal insurrectionist threats. At which point the invisible empire of the KKK has actively infected the systems, which has actively compromised, in many estimates, majority power structures inside the federal government, especially the FBI, which has attempted Nazi coups in the past and has subordinated the transfer of those coups to the military, which has actively intimidated presidents into compliance with the Confederacy. At which point the respecting of power is a specific violation of their service to law, as the service to law is the use of all power as a third-party structure which cannot be judged in its own cause, and thus the power is irrelevant, the status is irrelevant, the wealth is irrelevant under the lawful structures of the United States, making the obligation for them to engage in the full correction by their subordination to the rule of law under the constitutional republic, at which point the full due diligence being subordinated allows for our processing of their criminal actions and non-criminal actions into the full due diligence of non-violent court functions under the mechanism of the dual, which is David Bowles as general over the intelligence oversight, having full authority over the United States military, engaging in the full due diligences of the arguments in Congress to get Congress to declare war on the Confederacy or to declare war on the United States Republic, and renouncing the United States permanently, generating the obligation to publicly and internationally be one country or its enemy.